Before the story begins, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know. What time do you usually watch videos? And don't forget to suggest the next story or content you'd like to see. Story 1. The Wedding Picture That Smiled Back. When my grandmother passed away, my family gathered to clean out her old house. She had lived in that Victorian home for nearly 60 years, and every room was crowded with relics from another time. Heavy curtains, faint perfume clinging to the air, photo albums stacked like forgotten bricks on sagging bookshelves. My mother asked me to help sort through the bedroom, where most of the family keepsakes were kept, while she dealt with paperwork downstairs. I wasn't expecting to find anything remarkable, but tucked into a drawer lined with yellowed newspaper, I found a framed black and white wedding photograph. It was large, perhaps 11 by 14, and heavy in my hands, the glass faintly clouded by dust. The couple in the photo were unfamiliar to me, though the bride bore a striking resemblance to my grandmother in her younger years, her expression much harder, her eyes sharper. The groom, tall and stern, had his arm hooked rigidly through hers. Both of their faces were stoic, their mouths pressed into thin lines, as if smiling was too frivolous for such an occasion. I carried it downstairs and asked my mother about it. She froze. "That's my mother's first marriage," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly would make the memory real. "Before she met your grandfather, she never spoke about him. He died. Suddenly. Just after the wedding." Her tone discouraged more questions, but the way she quickly looked away from the photograph unsettled me. I placed it back in the room, leaning the frame against the wall. Something about the bride's eyes bothered me. They were watchful, almost alive. That night, after everyone left, I decided to stay over and help more the following morning. I unrolled a sleeping bag on the living room couch. At about 2 in the morning, restless, I wandered upstairs for a glass of water. The hall was dim, only lit by a sliver of moonlight sneaking in through the curtains. As I passed my grandmother's bedroom, I stopped. The photograph. The bride's face had changed. Her lips, which had been tight and solemn, were now curved ever so slightly into a smile. Not a broad grin, but a small, knowing upturn at the corners. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I stood frozen in the doorway, the sound of my pulse thundering in my ears. I convinced myself it was my exhaustion, or the strange distortion of light on glass. I backed away, shut the door, and went downstairs. The next morning, in daylight, I checked the picture again. The faces were back to their original expressions. Severe, joyless, unsmiling. I nearly laughed at myself for being so paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that fleeting grin. Over the next week, as we continued sorting through the house, I kept checking the photo. For days, nothing changed. But on the 4th night, I saw it again. Only this time, the smile was wider. The bride's lips pulled back enough to show her teeth, dark shapes beneath the faded gloss of the print. Her eyes seemed to glitter faintly, like there was something moving behind them. The groom remained as rigid and lifeless as always, but the bride's expression radiated intent. I called my mother into the room. "Look," I said, pointing. "It changed. She's smiling." But my mother frowned, confused, and shook her head. "No, it's the same as always. You're imagining things." I wanted to argue, but when I looked again, the face was back to its original, unsmiling state. My mother gave me a wary glance and walked away, muttering that I was scaring myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I went upstairs, pulled the photograph out of the frame, and inspected it under a lamp. The paper was brittle but intact, the ink faded but consistent. There were no alterations, no marks, no signs of tampering. I slid it back in and leaned the frame against the wall. The next day, I woke up to find the photo sitting upright on the dresser, facing my bed. I hadn't put it there. This time, the bride's smile stretched unnaturally wide across her pale face, her teeth sharper, more distinct than the grainy photo should have allowed. The longer I stared, the more the curve of her lips seemed to move, as if she were actively grinning at me, right then and there. My stomach turned cold. I covered the frame with a pillow and forced myself to leave the room. I begged my mother to throw the picture away, but she refused. "It's part of our family history," she insisted. "You're letting your imagination run wild." So that night, when she wasn't looking, I took the photograph into the backyard and shoved it deep into the garbage bin. I went to bed relieved, certain I'd finally freed myself from it. But when I woke the next morning, the frame was back in my grandmother's room, perched neatly on the dresser, the glass polished clean. The bride's smile had changed again. Her head was tilted slightly, her gaze angled directly at me, as though she had been waiting. I locked myself in the bathroom and didn't come out for hours. When I finally did, I found my mother standing in the doorway of the bedroom, holding the frame. She looked pale, shaken. "I saw it too," she whispered. She was smiling at me. We didn't discuss it again, but neither of us wanted to keep the picture. That evening, we drove it to the far side of town and left it in a donation bin for an antique shop. I don't know who has it now. Sometimes I imagine someone buying it, hanging it proudly in their home, laughing at how grim and serious the newlyweds looked. And then one night, catching sight of it in the dark and realizing the bride is no longer as expressionless as she once was, that she's smiling back. Story 2, the family portrait with an extra face. When I was a teenager, my parents decided it was time to have a proper family portrait taken. My mom had always loved photographs, but most of our pictures were candid snapshots, messy, imperfect, and scattered across half-filled albums. She wanted something professional, something that could hang proudly in the living room and become a family heirloom. My dad agreed, mostly because he thought it would make her happy. So one Saturday afternoon, we all piled into the car and drove to a photography studio downtown. The studio was old-fashioned, with heavy velvet curtains, antique chairs, and those umbrella lights that made everything look brighter than real life. The photographer was a middle-aged man with a wide smile and a soft, calming voice. He arranged us carefully, instructing my dad to stand behind the chair, my mom to sit in the center, and my younger brother and me to stand on either side. We went through several poses, serious expressions, smiling, turning slightly left or right, until the photographer seemed satisfied. "Perfect," he said finally, lowering his camera. "This one will be timeless." My mom beamed. My dad sighed in relief, glad it was over. We left the studio that day with the promise that the finished photograph would be ready for pickup in 2 weeks. When my mom finally brought the framed portrait home, she placed it on the mantel with almost ceremonial care. The photo was large, glossy, and beautifully lit. At first glance, it was everything she had hoped for. All 4 of us frozen in one perfect moment, smiling together as if nothing in the world could go wrong. But the longer I stared at it, the more unsettled I felt. There was something odd about the background. Behind us, where there should have only been a plain, dark curtain, there was something else. At first, I thought it was a shadow, some trick of the lighting. But when I leaned closer, my stomach dropped. Between my brother and me, faint but undeniable, was the outline of a face. It wasn't any of ours. The face was pale, with hollow eyes and thin lips curled into what could only be described as a smirk. It looked almost transparent, as though it had been caught halfway between existing and fading away. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there. "Mom," I whispered, pointing. "Do you see that?" She leaned in, squinting. For a moment, I thought she would dismiss it as dust or a flaw in the printing. But I saw her expression change, her own smile fading as the color drained from her cheeks. She didn't say anything, just picked up the frame and hurried into the kitchen. That night, after my brother had gone to bed, I overheard my parents talking in hushed voices. My mom insisted we take the picture back, have it redone, maybe demand a reprint. My dad argued that it was just a photographic error, an overlap, maybe a reflection. "There's no such thing as ghosts in pictures," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But my mom didn't return it. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to. Instead, she tucked the portrait away in the hallway closet, behind old blankets and boxes of Christmas decorations. I thought that was the end of it, except it wasn't. A week later, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of muffled laughter. It wasn't my brother's voice, and it wasn't coming from my parents' room. It was low, scratchy, almost like it came from an old recording. I sat up, heart pounding, and realized it was coming from the hallway. Creeping out of bed, I cracked open my door and peeked down the hall. The closet door, the one that hid the portrait, was wide open, and in the faint glow of the nightlight I saw it. The frame leaned against the blankets, the glass reflecting just enough light for me to make out our faces. And there, between my brother and me, the extra face looked clearer, sharper. And this time, its mouth was wide open, as though it were laughing. I froze, unable to move. The sound seemed to grow louder, filling the hallway, echoing in my skull. I slammed my door shut and didn't sleep until morning. When I told my mom, she looked stricken but refused to discuss it. She only said, "Don't open that closet again. Do you understand?" I nodded, but the unease stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening in the house. My brother would wake up crying, saying a man had been standing by his bed, smiling at him. My dad, ever the skeptic, grew increasingly irritable, as though something invisible pressed on him day and night. And my mom, well, she stopped sleeping altogether. I would find her sitting in the hallway, back against the wall, staring at the closed closet door as if daring it to open. One night, unable to bear the tension any longer, my dad announced he was throwing the photograph away. He stormed into the closet, pulled it out, and carried it to the backyard trash bin. I watched from my bedroom window as he dropped it in, muttering under his breath. The next morning, it was back on the mantel. None of us had brought it inside. This time, the face was no longer faint. It was fully visible, clearer than any of ours. And it wasn't just smirking, it was grinning, wide and sharp, as though reveling in the fact that it had been noticed. We never talked about it again. My mom wrapped the portrait in an old sheet and drove it to a storage unit across town, locking it away with boxes of forgotten furniture. We moved houses not long after, and as far as I know, the photograph is still there, gathering dust. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that grin, about how it seemed to be watching us, waiting. And I wonder if one day, in some forgotten box, someone else will pull back the sheet, lift the frame, and find themselves staring into that same hollow gaze. Only this time, maybe the face won't stay inside the picture. Story 3, the graduation photo, that grew darker. When I graduated from college, my parents were beyond proud. They had saved up money for me to get professional graduation photos taken, something they said I would cherish for years. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just excited to have finally finished school, but I agreed. A week after the ceremony, I went to a small studio downtown where the photographer had me stand against a pale gray backdrop in my cap and gown. He adjusted the lighting, told me to smile, and clicked the shutter. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. When the proofs arrived by email a few days later, the pictures looked fine. My smile was stiff, but that was to be expected. My mom picked her favorite, one where I was holding the diploma and looking off slightly to the side. We had it printed in a large frame and placed it in the living room, right on the mantel above the fireplace. At first, it was nothing more than a nice reminder of the milestone. But within a month, I noticed something strange. The background of the photo, once a clean light gray, seemed darker than I remembered. I chalked it up to the lighting in the living room. Shadows from the lamp, maybe. But a week later, the change was undeniable. The pale gray had shifted to a stormy charcoal, the kind of darkness that made it look like I was standing in a void. I asked my mom if she noticed. She frowned, leaning in close, then shook her head. "It looks the same to me," she said. My dad agreed. Neither of them could see what I was seeing, and when I tried to show them, they accused me of being overly tired or paranoid. But I couldn't shake it. Every time I walked past that mantel, the darkness in the photo seemed thicker. I pulled up the original email proofs from the photographer on my phone, and sure enough, the background was still light gray. The photo in the frame, though, continued to deepen in shadow. Then came the second change. One night, I was coming home late from work. I dropped my bag by the door and glanced toward the mantel. My stomach lurched. The me in the photo wasn't smiling anymore. The stiff, polite smile had melted into something else, something closer to a grimace. My lips were downturned, my eyes darker, colder. I flicked on the lights, thinking it was a trick of the shadows, but no, the face in the frame was mine, yet it wasn't. I yanked the photo out of the frame, heart pounding. Under the glass, the glossy surface was smooth, untampered with. My parents, woken by the noise, came rushing in. When I held it up to them, desperate for validation, they just looked at me like I was crazy. "That's the same picture we hung up weeks ago," my mom insisted. "Nothing's changed." But it had. I knew it. The following days were worse. I stopped looking directly at the photo, but I could feel it. The weight of its gaze pressing into me whenever I entered the room. Sometimes in my periphery, I swore the reflection of the room in the glass was darker than the actual living room, like the photo was becoming its own separate place. Then one night, when I couldn't take it anymore, I decided to test myself. I set up my phone camera on a tripod across from the mantel, pointing directly at the framed photo. I left it recording overnight. When I checked the footage the next morning, I nearly dropped my phone. At 3:17 a.m., the image in the frame moved. Not the photo shifting, not the frame falling. My photographed self moved. I saw my own eyes blink. My smile twisted downward into a sneer. And then, slowly, I raised my hand in the photo and pressed it flat against the inside of the glass. I screamed and slammed the laptop shut. My mom came running again, but when I showed her the footage, the recording had corrupted. Static across the screen, the file unreadable. She accused me of overworking myself, maybe even hallucinating. But I knew what I saw. I decided to remove the photo entirely. That night, while my parents were asleep, I crept into the living room and grabbed the frame. As soon as I touched it, a chill shot up my arms, numbing my fingertips. I carried it into the garage, set it on the workbench, and smashed the glass with a hammer. The sound was sharp, but what horrified me wasn't the shattering. It was the black smoke that poured from the cracked photo, spilling out like ink in water. It swirled and writhed, almost alive, before dissipating into the air. I stared at the photo itself. The image was no longer of me smiling in cap and gown. It was a blurred, twisted version of my face, stretched too wide, eyes hollow and dark, staring directly at me. I tried to tear the photo apart, but the paper wouldn't rip. It bent, creased, but wouldn't tear. I ended up locking it in a box and burying it behind the shed. That was 6 months ago. The mantel is empty now, but sometimes when I sit in the living room at night, I swear I can see the faint reflection of myself smiling in the blank space above the fireplace, smiling that wrong, grimacing smile. And last week when I opened my email, I found a new message. No sender, just a file attached, a photo. It was me, in my cap and gown, against a background so black it looked endless. And this time I wasn't smiling at all. Story 4, the old Polaroid that rewrote itself. When I was 14, I found an old Polaroid camera buried at the bottom of a cardboard box in my grandmother's attic. The camera was yellowed with age, its once white body now a faded cream, but when I opened the back, I was surprised to see a full cartridge of unused film still inside. My grandmother, who had been watching me dig through her old belongings, smiled nostalgically and said, "Oh, that old thing? Haven't seen it in decades. Go ahead and keep it if you'd like." I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, it was just a cool, vintage camera, the kind that could make instant photos without needing a printer. I took it home and set it on my dresser, planning to use it the next day with my friends. The first photo I ever took with it was of my dog, Max. He was lounging on the couch, tail wagging lazily. The picture developed slowly, colors bleeding into place until Max's figure appeared. But there was something odd about the photo. The couch was right, Max was right. But behind him, the window blinds were open. In reality, I knew they'd been closed. I brushed it off as some sort of artifact, a quirk of old film. That night, I snapped another picture, this time of my bedroom. The instant print slid out with a satisfying click. I set it down, waiting for the image to fade into clarity. But when the picture finally finished developing, my stomach dropped. The photo showed my room, exactly as it was, except there was a man standing in the corner. He was blurry, faceless, just a shadowy figure, but his posture was unmistakable. He stood angled toward my bed, toward me. I checked the corner, my breath shallow, but of course, no one was there. Just my bookshelf, stacked with games and school trophies. I laughed nervously and told myself maybe it was some kind of double exposure, or maybe a smudge on the film. But still, I stuffed the picture deep in my drawer and turned the lights on before I went to bed. The next morning when I woke, the photo was sitting on my nightstand. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't moved it. And worse, the figure was clearer now. He wasn't blurry anymore. His face was still obscured, but his outline was sharper. His hands hung stiffly at his sides. He looked closer to the bed. I tried to throw the picture away. I tore it in half, then in half again, and shoved the pieces into the kitchen trash. By the time I got home from school that day, the picture was back on my nightstand, perfectly intact. From then on, the Polaroid seemed to have a mind of its own. Even if I didn't use it, new photos would appear, sliding slowly out of the slot as though someone or something had pressed the shutter. Once, I came home to find 3 photos on my desk. Each one showed a different part of my house: the kitchen, the hallway, my bedroom. In every photo, the figure appeared again, watching, waiting. Each day, the figure crept closer. At first, he was at the edge of the frame, then in the middle of the room, and eventually standing at the foot of my bed. My parents didn't believe me when I tried to show them. They said the photos just looked like light tricks and reminded me that Polaroid film degraded over time. But I knew better. I could feel it. Whatever it wasn't just film. One night, after weeks of sleeplessness, I decided to confront it. I set the Polaroid camera on the floor, aimed at my bed, and waited. Hours passed in darkness. I must have dozed off because the sound of the camera shutter clicking jolted me awake. Heart pounding, I leaned over and picked up the fresh photo as it slid out. In the picture, I was asleep in my bed. My body was turned on my side, my face half buried in the pillow. But there was someone else in the frame, too. The man was kneeling next to me, his faceless head inches from mine. His hand hovered just above my neck. I threw the picture across the room, my heart racing so violently I thought it might burst. I turned on every light and didn't sleep a second more that night. By morning, I made up my mind. I stuffed the camera and the pictures into a shoebox, taped it shut, and shoved it into the attic. I told myself I wouldn't go near it again. For weeks, nothing happened. No new photos, no appearances. I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head. But then, a month later, I found another photo on my desk. I hadn't gone near the attic. I hadn't touched the box. Yet here it was. The photo showed me sitting at my desk, looking right at the camera. The same desk where I was now holding it. Except in the picture, the man was standing behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see him, but the room was empty. Empty except for me. That was years ago. I don't use cameras anymore, not even the one on my phone. Every time I see an old Polaroid, my stomach churns. I moved away from my grandmother's house, left everything behind, even Max. But sometimes, I'll wake up and find a picture waiting on my nightstand. Always fresh, always crisp, and in every single one, the man is still there, watching me, getting clearer, getting closer. Photographs are supposed to preserve a single, unchanging moment in time, but these stories prove otherwise. When the images you trust to remain still begin to shift, twist, and reveal things that should never have been there, it leaves you with only one terrifying thought. If the pictures aren't lying, then reality itself might be. So the next time you flip through your photo albums, take a closer look. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay frozen. It watches, it waits, and it changes when no one is looking.